let's move on to our next segment. We've got Farooq joining us here. Mr. Farooq Kathwari, are you there?
I am here, and good to be on this program.
Great to have you. So for our viewers, so they know, Mr. Farooq is the chairman, CEO, and president of Ethan Allen Interiors, which, full disclosure, the couch in my living room is Ethan Allen. So you got good style. And then on a much more serious note, he is also a committee member for the Task Force on Extremism in Fragile States. Welcome. So glad to have you.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, and I like your taste.
I actually also like Ethan Allen, for the record. I don't have a piece yet, but maybe we could talk after this. But anyway, on to the more important news. So Farooq, could you tell us a little bit about the Task Force on Extremism in Fragile States?
Well, I have had an opportunity of being associated with the United States Institute of Peace for over 20 years. For me, the issues that we are faced with are somewhat personal. I grew up in an area of conflict, that is Kashmir. I have seen personal challenges and tragedies. I have seen, and I've spent the last 25 years, in fact, working to see how we can help in these areas of conflict. So this task force, when they asked me to join, I agreed because we have to move to the next step. The first step was the 9/11 Commission, and they did a good job. But today we have to also now go to the next level of seeing what can be done. What are the issues or the underlying issues that end up with fragility and then end up with extremism? So I'm very happy to be part of this very auspicious group of people who have joined this task force.
Well, and Farooq, so in light of the September 11th anniversary this year, the 17th anniversary, your task force put out a report that said that while we've been able to protect the American homeland, we've actually seen a spike overseas since 9/11 in terrorism. What's driving that increase? And do you think that, what needs to be done to make sure it's great that we've protected our homeland from these large-scale attacks since then, but do you see risks? What risks do you see since this is increasing overseas, that knock on wood, that this protection we have so far, how do we keep that?
Well, you're right. A good job has been done in protecting, but we have seen an increase in fragility, increase in extremism, increase in all kinds of challenges in the rest of the world. And in my view, and of course the report discusses it in greater detail, which is that fragility of states is an important element which has given rise to extremism. Fragility basically means poor governance. In many of these states where we have seen increase in extremism, increase in people joining to be extremists, is that they have not been treated well. There's been injustice. They don't have social services. And unfortunately, some of it is due to the fact of the unintended consequences of actions of the last 70, 80 years. It didn't happen yesterday. So we have to look at it to see how can we, the United States, and in fact the rest of the world, help better governance, better infrastructure, better education, and then, I'm an American and I'm a Muslim.
So there are people that would argue. I don't know if you saw this news. This was about a few months ago that the UN Special Rapporteur came to the U.S. and said that basically there are levels of poverty here that are equal to that in the third world. That America is basically the richest, poorest country in the world. And then, if you look at Flint, Michigan, there's still no potable water. And what do you say to people that think that America has so many of its internal problems? And that's actually one of the things that President Donald Trump got elected on, right? This idea of America first, that it should be focusing instead on building up its own capacity rather than allocating resources to quote unquote fragile states. That in itself, it is a fragile state in a way.
You're absolutely right. In fact, when I joined this, I mentioned to the committee that we are living in a fragile state right here. At Ethan Allen, I mentioned to them, every week I have about 60 of our leaders talk about 5 important subjects. Every week, 60 of them send a report, and the first one is on talent and leadership. If we don't have leadership and don't have talent, nothing much is going to happen. Second, I mentioned is the fact that what is the message of leadership? And I'll come back to your question because they're interrelated. That the message of the leadership has to be that the main job of a leader is to help their people become better, not to take the most out of them. I'm talking about an enterprise because our enterprises are fragile if we don't address the issues I'm talking about. Third thing I talk about is service. What kind of infrastructure do we have? And when you talk of nations, what kind of education? When you talk of Flint, what kind of services are we providing to our people? And then the fourth thing is technology. Today, technology is prevalent. Today, you've got social media. A lot of these people, whether it's Flint or in Somalia, they are on social media. And the fifth, as an enterprise, as a country, is social responsibility. So I agree with you. You know, I run an enterprise and I have maintained manufacturing in some very tough areas of the country. The Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. I have been and I have seen. So our first responsibility, I agree, is to our own communities, but I'm not talking of just the necessity of spending a lot of money. There's a lot of money around in the world which I believe is not being spent as wisely as it should be. So we as leaders have to help them focus on the right priorities and spending the money in the right way.
Well, and Farooq, isn't part of it, I would make the argument that part of the underlying forces driving fragility in these extreme states is the radicalization that so many young men, even if they have economic opportunities, they reject them because they have become radicalized. They've become just obsessed with the notion that they need to engage in conflict in order to prove themselves. I mean, they have lots of reasons why they do it. Why are these young men predominantly, why do they get radicalized? How can we stop that culturally?
Yeah, it's a very good and important issue. And there are many, many reasons. The reasons are that when the leaders, there's a vacuum in leadership, the vacuum is filled by these so-called religious leaders. And you're talking of Muslims. These religious leaders have taught the principles of Islam in the wrong way. You know, I grew up in a Muslim state, in a Muslim country, a society. We were taught when we were growing up that the main aspect of Islam is to be a good person, to submit to goodness. But now, unfortunately, what's happened is the leaders are not playing their role. The leadership has been taken over by these elements who have projected Islam, in my view, a wrong way, and many young people fall for that. So we have to help shape the debate, because unfortunately, you're right, Islam has been almost hijacked by a lot of these elements who preach that violence is the way to go, and we have to help change that.
Well, Farooq, thank you so much for joining us. I think your voice is so important. Muslims who have grown up and seen the importance of peace, the importance of being a good citizen. I mean, these are the values that I applaud you for what you're doing. I think it's so important for Americans and the West to support people like you and what you're doing. Thank you so much for joining us, Farooq Kathwari.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be with you.
Thank you.